This is based on some teaching I've done for several years in writing research proposals and applications, aimed mostly at NIH, but usually generalizable to other settings. So this is the session where I talk about the various forms of NIH applications and also how to create names page. Now, going forward, just to let you all know, I'm anticipating that as we move into the third seminar, there will be a component in which people will bring their research to the table. I already have one group that have communicated with me that seems interested in bringing their proposal in. I would ask people to try to draft a specific aims page for conversation in this setting, so we can get the best input, maybe even get collaborators. So the aim is to have this be a real working group to make things happen. So let me turn to the next slide, Jean. So this is first part is the format for the several forms of investigator-initiated applications. Next page. You have to probably click down to get the rest of the page. So there are many forms, ways you can be supported by NIH, but the subset we're most interested in is investigator-initiated research. And it's worth distinguishing between grants and contracts. For grants, we write applications. For contracts, we write proposals. And the term we use in this course is application. And the degree of independence of the investigator varies to some extent by the type of grant. So the R, everything that has an R in front of it is investigator initiated. It's the research you want to do, not the research NIH wants you to do. F and K grants, which I'll go over, are also investigator initiated. Next bullet point. One more. There's a category of grants called the U grants, which are cooperative agreements in which you, together with NIH, the INFO program is a U grant. It's a cooperation between NIH and the investigators and the investigators institution and participants. Contracts, by contrast, which is what the old National Film Study used to be, you do just what NIH wants you to do and nothing else. That's the most limited form of investigator involvement. Next slide. So here's the R series. The R01 is the basic grant, no budget limit. There's a bit of an overtone, isn't there? Is there something I can do about that?
I feel like everybody needs to maybe mute their mic or something, because yeah, I keep hearing like feedback.
Okay, can everybody try to mute, see if that helps? So the R01 has no budget limit, but permission must be obtained 1 month in advance if you want to spend more than $500,000 a year. On the other side, if it's less than 250K, the budget can be modular. It doesn't have to have as much detail. The maximum duration is generally 5 years, and a lot of people, pretty much everybody does apply for 5 years. Some people apply for less. Linked to that is the R03 is the small grants program. That's $100,000 over 2 years. This is good for some small projects, data analyses. As I'll show you in a moment, not every institute supports every grant format. So, depending on what you're researching, you have to pay attention to what the institute supports. The R21 is called a developmental grant. It has a limit of $275,000 over 3 years. Much less need for prior data, but it's often advertised as you don't need any data. It's just a shot in the dark. You're beginning something. Not quite, as I've seen on study section. You have to have a little bit of something going on. And then recently, in the last few years, we've seen the development of the R34. This is a nice thing to know about. It's called the NIH Clinical Trial Planning Grant. It permits you to really plan a grant with NIH support, get all the components together, get the surveys together, find the centers you're going to work with, find out where you're going to recruit participants. So usually there's a 1-year grant, but they can be up to 3, and usually they're modest in budget, up to 100K. but some have been much larger. And again, this is not every NIH institute that uses this. So if you think of a clinical research grant trial, keep an eye on the R34. Next slide. Now, F awards are very important to those of you who are still in training, either pre-doctoral or postdoctoral. These are individual awards. You write it yourself. F31 is pre-doc, F32 is postdoc, F30 is just for MD, PhD students. And these kinds of applications include a scientific plan and a proposed training program. You have to say how you're going to be trained. You must be full-time in research apart from courses you're taking. In some ways, Fs are easier to get than some other grants, but there's a great variation by institute. The Fs, I think, as I recollect, which I think it's the F31, that is that child health was very difficult to get. But then there were some institutes that, like the Eye Institute, the Hearing Institute, that didn't get as many applications, and you had a better funding cutoff. The judgment of your grant is made by a study section, but how far down the list that one goes depends on how much money the institute who's funding your grant has. Next page. And then there are the K awards. Probably many of you are familiar with these. These are mentored awards. They're not quite like an F award, which is just yourself. The K award is usually for junior faculty, with one exception. And as you start your work, you decide to work with one or more faculty mentors who help you develop your research program. You must commit 75% to research. This makes it hard for some people on clinical lines to participate in K series. There's the KO1 is the most basic. That is the most basic biomedical, behavioral, clinical science. Usually this is for PhDs, but there are two additional ones that are a little bit more oriented towards people who do clinical work, the KO8 and the K23. The KO8 requires you, but they both require you to have a clinical doctoral degree, which usually means an MD or a PhD in nursing. But there are other, certainly osteopathy is accepted. There's a doctorate in naturopathy or whatever that is. That's also accepted. There are a variety of things that can be put under the K08, K23. And they focus a little, K23 focuses a little more on the very clinical parts of research. About 20 years ago, or maybe a little less than that, the NIH came up with a K99R00, which is abbreviated, reminds people of the word kangaroo for some reason. So it's a hybrid between a K and an R, because you get 3 years of postdoc support and 2 years of faculty support. So you write basically a training grant and a kind of R01, an early R01. This is a very nice thing to have. I know some people have it. I think we have somebody in our epi department with one of those. And most recently, the neurosciences, I think this is mostly, I'm not quite sure. I think it's out of the mental health, or maybe NINDS, the Neurological Institute. If a special K99R00 just for underrepresented minorities in neuroscience research. It's called DSPAN. I'm not quite sure what the abbreviation stands for. I don't know if this has been generalized beyond neuroscience research as yet. Next slide. So here's an important point to know. There are 27 NIH agencies and 5 offices. There's the Office of Women's Health, Office of Minority Health, Office of the Director. They can also provide grant support. Every one of them supports R01s, but not every one of them supports some of the subdivisions. And I had looked at this a while ago, and I haven't updated it. But for example, at one point, the R21 was only supported by about 2/3 of agencies, the R03 by only about a half. And some had special kinds of R03s, NCI and ASHD both have that. A certain kind of R03, not just any open-ended R03. And the F grants are not always supported by everyone. It's interesting to see that there are just some agencies that don't support postdocs. Not only a minority, but still. So when you apply for a grant, you have to have some sense of which agency might be funding the grant. Obviously, if it's in child health, We'll talk a little bit about your relationship with the agency in a moment. Next slide. Now, there are things called funding announcements, FOAs. In other words, NIH advertises some research it would like to see done. And I'm going to order these from the most independent to the least independent. The most independent is where you see PA, program announcement. All that means is that NIH is interested in certain topics. It will say, like the NICHD had a program announcement surrounding research on premature birth. So if you're writing on premature birth, you say, well, we noticed that NIH has a program announcement about premature birth. It's number, whatever the number was. And that can help you sometimes at the edge. If you're scored at the edge and there's a program announcement about your topic, that might push you up a little bit. And I've actually seen that happen once in a grant that I was involved with. PAR is a slight version of that, but it has a special review, and the review is by the institute rather than the usual NIH study section program. So the R stands for review. Both of these are fairly independent. They just that the NIH is showing, it'd be nice to see something in this arena. A cooperative agreement, I've mentioned that already, the U series. This is where the research is shared between NIH and a principal investigator. This is true of the ECHO program overall. It's a cooperative agreement. Both we have equal, in principle, the investigators and NIH have equal stake in the research. And NIH to some extent directs the research, but the investigators play a large role as well. The next level is RFA, request for applications. They have already done a lot of the thinking. We want a trial on folic acid in pregnancy or something like that. A lot of it, the core idea is already there. They're really looking for someone to really write a nice application that can do good research in that arena. And then the least independent is the request for proposal, which is for a contract. They describe a contract, and essentially you have to provide deliverables, and you have very little freedom of scientific thought there. So a lot of people do keep an eye on these various announcements, but as I'll say, there are problems with them. First of all, this is the kind of thing, RFAs and RFPs attract a lot of people, especially the private sector. There are companies that do nothing much more than respond to RFAs and RFPs, especially RFPs. They do contract work for the government. The term sometimes has been given to these companies beltway bandits because they surround Washington, D.C., and Virginia and Washington, and they're constructed so as to get, some of them are very successful, do very, very well financially. And frankly, you have to guess what they're thinking rather than what you're thinking. There is a certain evidence that they could be written in ways that especially privilege certain centers that NIH knows is doing a lot of that kind of stuff already. We call that being wired. It's not supposed to happen, but we sense that obviously sometimes you read an RFA and you say, oh, this is perfect for those guys up there in, where, in some other place. And of course, you can't get credit for your original idea and much less opportunity to be creative scientifically. So it's okay to look at RFAs, especially program announcements are fine, but be aware that you don't have as much independence scientifically. Next slide. So if you do want to shop around, here's some useful websites. I just updated these, so I know these work. So all federal grant opportunities have to be listed on grants.gov. That's not only just NIH, but CDC and I don't know, the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, you name it, it's there. A very good website is the NIH website on how to apply for grants, some of which I've kind of tried to summarize quickly here to save you some effort. And I would say don't forget foundations. I'm not going to talk much about foundations. Every foundation has a different format, but there is an online directory of foundations, and foundation support can be very helpful in getting started. The funds are usually not so much as NIH. Indirects are small or non-existent, which doesn't make your administrators and your university happy. They usually, not always, they're usually less competitive. There are some famous foundation supports like the March of Diane Basil O'Connor Awards or the American Heart Association Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. They're really quite tough to get. And sometimes we forget the local foundation. I had a graduate student who got $10,000 from the Michigan Leukemia Foundation, helped him do a small study of the etiology of leukemia. So keep your eyes posted for, especially if you're getting started out, for something that you might be able to write to a small local foundation or even a national foundation. It might be a step on the way to getting support from NIH. Next slide. I double-checked the due dates, and to my surprise, they haven't changed in at least a decade. They all have specific due dates. In general, new submissions have one date, but if you're resubmitting a grant you already submitted, you're fixed at about, they're usually 1 month later. And I won't go over these in any detail, but these are the deadlines. They're usually 3 NIH deadlines a year, one every 4 months. And so every 4 months, you have another shot at getting your NIH project funded. Next slide. Page limits. I want to give some technical details here. The first is page limits. You have the main thing to note is that the R03, R21, and FF is basically 6 pages of text and 1 page of specific aims, whereas the R01s and the some of the R20, some forms of R, I realize I didn't explain the R33. In fact, I can't remember exactly what it is. But anyway, it has like R01's a 12-page limit plus a 1 page for specific aims. Biosketches are limited to 5 pages. Appendix doesn't have page limits, but there are restrictions on what you can put in it. And a few more technical details, which I'll give you. Next slide. You have a specific, they recommend 4 different font types. You can use others, but they have to be a font size of 11 points or larger. I know of applications sent back unread because someone used the wrong font. Can you believe it? Yes, that has happened. And you still, even with Greek letters or special characters, you have to still have the same font size. I won't go over type density and type. That usually works with, say, an 11-point Arial. Everything works, and if you single space things. Here's a little point at the end. A smaller type size is allowed in figures and tables, but be very careful here because I have seen people kind of cheating on that, giving you like this incredibly tiny font in a table. And let me say, the most important thing in the world when you're writing an application is do not make the reviewer unhappy. Do not make the reviewer unhappy. Tiny, tiny font size, even though they're allowed in figures and tables, do not make reviewers happy. So keep in mind that it has to be legible, intelligible, and interesting. Next slide. The standard format of sheets of paper, half-inch margins, only 1 column, single-sided, single-spaced, consecutive page numbers. They don't like suffixes like 5A and 5B, and nothing should not be numbered. But these are all things you can glean from the NIH website. I'm just summarizing them for you. I think you can use margins that are larger. You can have more space, white space. I think that anything that produces a lot of white space on a page is good. Do not have pages that are pure text from top to bottom. That just irritates reviewers. Use paragraphs frequently, separated by at least a half a space, which is 6 points, a half of the line. Always make sure your tables and figures are very clear and very well placed, right where they should be. The ideal table, the ideal figure, and its heading could be completely self-explanatory. You could take it out of the grant, drop it on the floor, someone picks it up, and they know exactly what that table says. It's hard to do, but that's the best table you can make. Bulleted or numbered lists always help. And I can assure you that too many unexplained abbreviations are application killers. There are some people in the current world who like to speak in abbreviations. We call that abbreviababble. It's not a good thing to encourage in grant applications, I assure you. Try to make sure you every time you come across an abbreviation, you explain it. If you have about more than 5 or 10 abbreviations in your whole application, you can make a little glossary section, a little text box that says them all together. And I think another thing is there are no websites in your application. This is interesting. They don't like you to cite websites. They have a whole paragraph. You can go into the NIH rules on this. There are certain things that are allowed, some things are not allowed. So in general, you should be a little careful to limit your use of internet websites for referencing. And now we can talk a little bit about program offices and the grant management. NIH has staff who work for the institutes and oversee scientific programs. So you have two basic kinds: the program officer, who deals with all the scientific issues once the study is funded, and the grants management specialist who deal with the budgets. Now, these people are assigned at the time of study section assignment, and they can attend the review meeting. Now, the important thing to remember about the program people is they have nothing to do with the review process. Strong support from a program can help a proposal on the board, but it has nothing to do with the score. And I think this is a lesson that sometimes young investigators haven't quite internalized, that the program officer, you call a program officer and say, oh, that sounds like a wonderful topic. Go ahead, write a great proposal. We love it. And then they get turned down and the investigator scratches his head. But I'm sorry, the program officer's job is to get as many applications in his or her area as possible. And they don't make the decision. And I even had the experience, I'll take 1 minute of your time to tell you this, that I was once asked by a program officer to write a grant for a conference. They couldn't arrange the conference, but they could support it if someone wrote a grant for it. So I did what I was asked to. You want to keep the program officer happy. I did what he asked me. I didn't get funded. Called him up and I said, listen, you asked me to do this and now I'm not funded. He said, well, we didn't quite write it perfectly, but do it one more time. Same thing happened. And the third time he didn't call me. He was kind enough, so the program officer and the reviewers are not the same people, you have to be aware of that. And they will encourage things. What they can do is they can help you learn about the process. They can help you learn what the priorities of the institute are, but they have nothing to do with the actual study section review. You can discuss plans with them, make sure it's relevant to their mission. They may have insights into study sections. They often can give you feedback on the review if you've had a difficult review, especially if they attended, which they sometimes do. They can call you and say, listen, they loved it except for the statistical part, They can advocate for funding, not for the score, and they'll help you administer the grant if you get it. And this is not so common anymore, but they can read your grant for you and give you feedback. They're allowed to do that. And if you, as I said before, if you have a large budget, you need their approval. And if you do contact the program officers, try to give them some little summary of what you're planning. But important to remember, they are not study section and they don't fund anything themselves. Okay, that's just a quick overview. All of these things are available on the NIH web page. And this is just a quick summary to kind of orient you. Now, let me talk a little bit about creating the specific aims page, which is the core of the grant. Before you get to aims, there are two little sections that are read before the aims, the abstract or some project summary, which is limited to 30 lines of text and summarizes everything. I don't believe that these abstracts play as large a role in the decision process as the specific aims page and the rest of the project description. And then there's something called the project narrative. It's 2 or 3 sentences, which is intended for the public to summarize what you plan to do. And this is really not a terribly important thing. But the reason I mention these is because you don't want to repeat things said there in the next parts of the application. So let me turn to the next page. Okay, this is what the NIH says you should do for the aims page. State concisely the goals and summarize the expected outcomes, including the impact that the results will have. And then they want you to list succinctly the specific objectives of the research. e.g., to test a stated hypothesis, create a novel design, solve a scientific problem, etc., etc. So, next page. I think you have to probably hit all of these. What the goal of the aims page is the first real page that the reviewer looks at, and you want to engage the reviewer in your aims page. I sometimes have said that I think 50% of the decision is made by the time the aims page is read, because either the reviewer gets very excited by what you're planning to do, and then they look, I have to be frank, they look at your approach a little bit more positively, or they don't get excited by your aims and they can get very critical about, every little statistical nuance. So you really want to engage the reviewer in the problem and your solution to the problem. So you have to excite the reviewer by providing goals that are interesting and new. You have to impress the reviewer with goals that will advance the field. And also, this is very important, I think, establish your research niche, especially if you're young. Kind of what is it that you do that is distinct? And you kind of hope that the reviewer will say, oh, I'd like to see this research be done. It sounds interesting. Also, the aims page gives you a roadmap for your approach. It kind of gives you an organizational framework for the rest of the application. And also it gives you a little context for the aims. The aims cannot just stand alone, that you need a context for them. And I think also the aims are a way of convincing the reviewer that you're thinking scientifically, as I'll show in a few more slides. So generally, the way we organize an aims page is there's an overview that begins before you list your aims and hypotheses, a little bit of an overview. It can be a paragraph or two or three, which begins with the need. What is the need you're addressing? There's a problem out there. What is it? What are you addressing? Secondly, in what way will you be addressing that need? And the third one is, and I'm going to elaborate on all of these, is you give something of the setting of your study. Something of the, are you doing this in people or animals? Are you doing this in a clinic? Are you doing this in the general population? Whatever it is. And then you list the aims and hypotheses. And importantly, very important, at the very end, you have an impact statement. Describe what you think will change if your research succeeds. Remember, the criteria for NIH, overall criterion is impact. So if you have to, those last few lines in the specific aims page would say, this is what I think the impact will be if this works according to plan, if my research goes well. That's very, very important. Next page. So let's keep, yes, thank you. So that first paragraph is you identify the scientific and public health need you're addressing. Now, remember, it's always important to keep in mind that NIH is not NSF. It's not the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation banishes the word health. If you use the word health, you can't go to NSF. It's all about the science, but here it's both the science and the impact on health. And so you have to specify the need that's being filled. And then as you move on, you summarize your solution. And I say this is the first paragraph, but this is the first chunk of writing. It can be more than one paragraph. And you orient your reader to your study by providing a brief picture of the nature, size, location type of study. And always keep in mind, they say concisely and succinctly. Next slide. So important to say that the public health value of the study should not be placed in the overview. That belongs in impact at the end. And also remember that the project summary has been read already, the one I mentioned before. So don't replicate it. Try to summarize it briefly if you need to, but try to vary your language. And I think the overview of the aims that sets the stage is read more closely than the summary, abstract. So you need a strong opening statement that begins to frame the problem in a way relevant to the mission of NIH. Probably a little more than descriptive. I'll show you an example of what I think is not such a good way to start, but some people do start that way. There should be a few sentences distinguishing what we already know and what we need to know yet. And try to end on what you have perceived as the real critical need. That's the beginning part, the need part. And the need can be a scientific need or a clinical need or both. Either one, if you're advancing science because you're advancing a method, but the ultimate goal is health still, it's more of a scientific goal. If you're really actually trying to discover something specific about treatment or prevention of disease, then it's a very clinical one. But if you can merge the two, that's the strongest application. And I think sometimes people tend to begin a research with saying, with a simple statement of how large a burden. I don't think that works very well. Let me show you the next page. For example, if you start, and I've seen so many proposals begin this way, prostate cancer is a leading cause of cancer death in men, killing 200,000 Americans a year. Okay, that's fine. That's a nice, true thing, but it doesn't lead you anywhere. The second one, I'm just making this up, prostate cancer mortality, a leading cause of cancer death in men, has declined more than 50% in the past 20 years, and no one knows what. And if that gets you, you get to the fact that it's a problem, but now you've taken it from a simple public health statement to some, oh, there's a problem, there's an issue, there's a thought issue here. Then once you've established that there's a need, there's a problem, then you start with your long-range goal and you move to generally getting into where the objective of and the central hypothesis of the application, which you'll develop further under the specific aims. And of course, the need and the response have to match. They have to be together. Sometimes I find this sometimes the hardest to write, to simply describe how your approach is going to be a good, special, new, useful approach. What's special about it? But you have to try to work very hard to get there. It's usually a couple of sentences, not much more than that. And then, as I say, the third part of the overview gives you where you're doing this, how you're doing this. It doesn't have to be a separate section of the overview. You could weave it into the solution part. For example, you could say, in a large population-based study of middle-aged hypertensives, we will. So they get the picture of where you're doing this. Although sometimes it's hard to do, so you put a little paragraph in it and give some design features, just enough to orient the reader so he knows what you're doing, or she knows what you're doing. Next slide. I think it's overview section. There's sometimes three little sections, subsections: the need, the response, and so forth, and the context. It's maybe only 4 to 10 sentences or something like that, but those are worth crafting because they convey much of where you're headed. They summarize the main message. So you must have thought a great deal ahead of time for that. You can't do it casually, and you must be familiar with the state of the field. You must know what the next step is. You must know what others have done so that you can come in there and say, aha, but this is different. Sometimes you review things in that part. Then we move to specific aims and hypotheses. Sometimes it's a single aim with some subsidiary aims. Other times it's more than one aim, but it's not recommended you go much more than 3. Aims work well when accompanied by hypotheses that provide specificity to the aims that are more general. They can be subsets of the main aim. For example, we aim to do whatever you want to do by testing the following hypotheses. That you often see aims and hypotheses beneath them. Now, sometimes we get into a question: what is an aim? Is it an aim is what you will do, or is it an aim is what you're thinking? Is it conceptual or procedural? I think conceptual aims work better than procedural aims. Rather than listing what you will do, we will assemble 300 people and we will do this. That is not as exciting as the idea behind it. And you can provide that setting, those procedures in the paragraphs that precede the actual list of the aims. So I argue for organizing aims conceptually with procedural aspects playing a somewhat secondary role. Next. And the final paragraph is the impact statement. In a couple of sentences, explain what will happen to science or to public health if your research succeeds. If we manage to do this, we could reduce the frequency of premature birth by, or something like that. This is impact. And the best science in the world will not get funded if it has little impact. as the NSF is about science, but NIH ultimately is about health. Just one more thing about aims. And this really belongs under the specific aims, I think. Observational research tends to have larger and more general aims than clinical trials and often test several hypotheses. A clinical trial has to have one central hypothesis, but can have secondary hypotheses. Research in the early stages of understanding will be less detailed than in a field that's much more advanced. So I think in the earlier fields of research, and I have done this, you can include hypothesis generating aims. We really don't know much about this. Part of our work will be to look at our data and see if it generates any interesting questions that we could answer in another study. It's not, if you do that with a very well-established field, then that sounds a little hokey. But if you're really into something quite new, a field that hasn't been studied much, then hypothesis generation is legitimate, as long as you are careful to state it as such. A few aims dangers that I've noticed. Don't repeat the abstract. It's temptation to say, well, I wrote the abstract, I just plunk it in there as the overview. Don't do that. Aims without hypothesis are likely to come into criticism from people who say you have to have a hypothesis. If it's a very new field, everything is exploratory, maybe you could get away with it. Don't be vague in general in aims. Be as concrete as you possibly can. Try it with the same level of specificity as you use in the rest of your grant. And later, when you write the approach section, which is how you can actually carry this out, make sure it parallels the aims. A good use is to, when you write your approach, you take the first aim and you say, this is how we'll do that one. Second aim, this is how we'll do that one. That's a useful way to do it. Let's see where we are now. Oh, I think that's the end. All right, 43 minutes. Okay, so let me first say, I'm sure for many of you, I see some very experienced investigators out there who could have given even better. I'm sure Chris Johnson could have given this lecture much better than I could. Dan Keating also. But some of you young folks, just try to absorb those lessons, read those slides over, and they'll be available, of course, to all of you. And begin to think of ways in which you could maybe get a group of people together or just by yourself and pull together an aims page. Just the aims, what you plan to do, what you could do, just get it. And that's the beginning. And you've got something. And that aims page you can show to people. It's simple, it's one page. And you can refine it and get it stronger and stronger as you go along. And what we will do here next time we meet, which I think is the second week in March, is we're going to go over at least one, maybe more, aims pages that some of you have crafted. I already have a promissory note. I'm not going to hold anyone's feet to the fire, but I have a promissory note from someone, so we won't be empty-handed. And I will, in future sessions, maybe bring in other parts of the NIH application, a bit more briefly than today, maybe more like a 20-minute talk. And then we'll move on to some aims page, and we can all talk together, all throw our ideas in, and try to make something really creative. The ultimate goal here is to write a lot of proposals, a lot of good research that makes use of those great databases we've been spending years assembling. So might as well use them. And now that ECHO is not supporting our use of our local databases, this is all the more important because we can only do research that is now funded by ECHO that's ECHO-wide. So those of us who are not 100% supported by ECHO are free, and I'm not 100% supported by ECHO, but some of our people who work with us don't have other sources of funding, so they have to, if they're on the ECHO project, so they cannot participate in what we're doing right now unless we fund them. And so to analyze our own local data, we need to find new sources of funding. Okay, with that, let me open up for a conversation. I don't know quite. I think there's a raise your hand thing. Is that how we do it?
Yeah, or people can just unmute and
or people just unmute and say things.
If everyone talks at the same time, we'll try to figure out something else. But Nigel, thank you for that. It was really, really good. And I'm just going to tell everyone, I often tease you and say like, oh, I've learned everything I can from you because I've already had your grant writing class twice. I don't need to sit in again. But
You certainly
the truth
don't. Not with your grant success, Gene Kerber.
every single time I hear you talk, I learn something new. So I do appreciate it. Dan, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, thanks very much for that, Nigel. It's always good to go through how all this is structured because we don't always all keep it in mind. I had a sort of a follow-on question about, we obviously are aiming here to try to make better use or make more use of the charm data than have been the case in the past. And as you say, there's a lot of very interesting stuff there. So I had really two questions. One is, what would be the easiest way to get background details if we're putting together a specific aims and idea of pursuing it? Sort of,
well, in the
we have
last
questions about what's available and how available and all that sort of
right.
stuff.
We have a very thorough website in Charm that gives all the data dictionaries, all the forms, and in addition, the first talk I gave, I did a kind of synopsis of all the different concepts, a kind of quick and handy guide to them. So if you go back and they're going to be posted on the, maybe already posted, Gene, are they going to be posted? The first
Not
one?
posted yet, but we do have a recording and the slides from the
There'll be a
first one,
recording and a
and
slideshow. What I said the first time I had slides that summarized all the features, the different kinds of realms of investigation that we have data, the follow-up of neurodevelopmental follow-up, pregnancy, questionnaires about stress, all the things we have summarized. And the detail for that is on the website where you go in and you can look at every single instrument on the researcher page that we've used. So I think many of you already know many of the component parts. Steve knows all about the drugs we got information on. Miata knows about our placentas. So Louise helped us develop some of our questions about sleep in pregnancy. So there are all these component parts. And I urge you to just be ambitious and look them up and don't feel inhibited. Our goal is we're not believers in holding our data close to the chest. No, we want to distribute the data. We want people to make use of it. That's why it's on our website. We're not hiding anything. And don't hesitate to ask questions too. If you're unsure of something, we can help you orient you to the data. I see we have Caitlin Watson with us. Caitlin is our current data manager and knows the data very well, can answer many of your questions. And so, yeah, keep going.
Thank you.
I was waiting for Dan to have a follow-up, but since he's not.
Well, thanks for waiting. I was just wondering whether there's anything special about any of this that would need to be thought about if one were to be preparing an application around the fact that Charm is a part of ECHO and ECHO is funded. Is that something that sort of program officers are already very familiar with? Are there program officers in particular that you've had connections with that might be useful to chat with if we have a particular direction?
Well, that's a very good question. I really think that when ECHO decided in this second round that began last fall to say we don't support the individual cohorts, it left those individual cohorts free to go and be studied on their own. And we have a very special cohort in Michigan in that March is population-based due to the fabulous sampling. Daniel, you know all about it, of Mike Elliott and the outstanding group of people in the Survey Research Center. We have basically a population representative sample. So the generalization that you can make from it is much larger. It's a pretty good sample, 1,100 well-characterized pregnancies with biological samples, interviews, follow-up. Our follow-up rates are quite good, 80% in the first few years. So I think, it's a really outstanding, we've managed to pull together, thanks to the work of a lot of people, some of whom are actually on this call, like Jody and others who are actually working on the field. Brianna, we've got a great database, and it should be used. Now, someone has his or her hand up. They're only known as M63CJ39H29. So I don't know who that is. But your
I think
hand is
that's
up,
Chris
right?
Johnson. Are you there, Chris?
It's me. Can you hear me?
Who is it?
I was going to say that we put in a grant with Jim Gurn already.
Oh,
with,
great.
and we actually, it took some doing, and he would be able to give you the details, but we got a letter from Echo, from Matt supporting it.
Oh,
The grant.
nice. Of course, you have more than one center, because Jim is in
Yes.
Wisconsin and you guys, yeah, Chris, I should say, for those who don't know, Chris Johnson at Henry Ford has, not only is she linked to us and has been for many, many years, going back to the early days of the children's study, but she's also got her own ECHO grant, separate from this one, separate from the one, our ECHO grant. So we have an embarrassment of riches here. It's great. So that's good to know. It might be useful to have such a letter. I hadn't thought of that, but
Yeah,
that's a good idea.
At first, I think he was a little reluctant, but then was convinced that it was a good idea. So
All right. Well, we'll be asking you for copies of that letter so we can see.
Okay.
I hope it was very supportive. I expect it would be. Matt, by the way, we're talking about Matt Gilman, who is the, what is he? I don't know if he's PI. He's the director of the ECHO grant overall, the ECHO program nationally. Thank you, Chris. That's very helpful. Sure. Other questions? I should tell you that there's, Miata is here and she works with us on the placentas. It was not required to collect placentas in the first wave of ECHO. It might be required in the second. I think that's being sorted out, probably will be. But we collected placentas and we sent them all to a special laboratory in New York State. We have half of all placentas in ECHO. Of half of the 35 centers, we have half of the placentas that were collected. We have some 700 plus placentas in storage, all many of them already fully characterized by Carolyn Salafia. 575 have been, all the pathology is there. We have measurements, in some of them, very sophisticated measurements. And of course, we link it to clinical data. So that's a pretty unique database. And thankfully, Miata and some others are looking at that as well. And I think in the first wave of ECHO, we did put in some things ourselves. Now, in the second wave, we can put in nothing of our own. We have to follow the strict national protocol. But in the first one, we had some things that were our own, such as Louise O'Brien gave us guidance on sleep questions that were in addition to the sleep questions that ECHO provided, and so on and so forth. So we have any number of unique features that are not to be found in ECHO in general, in addition to the fact that we're population based in the state of Michigan.
I think we have Carolyn on the call. I don't know if she'd like to say anything, and it looks like Dan has his hand up again, unless it's,
Right.
Is that right,
Oh,
Dan?
sure, Dan. Or is Chris's hand, Chris, is your hand still up, or is that just left over? All right, Dan, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, so it was actually what you just, it was connected to what you were just speaking about, and this might be something that Caitlin could handle better offline, but one of the ideas that's come up is that the national protocol that everybody had to, the required things from everybody is in some ways impoverished, obviously, compared to what's available in CHARM. One of the questions has to do with harmonization of data measurement. That is to say, could one use what we have in CHARM and sort of running it with only the restricted data as well as with the richer data set, and to see what might then compare if you wanted to try to get bigger numbers that you can get with the whole ECHO kind of thing. So there's an easy way to tell what is, or what's unique to CHARM and what's applicable to the full national protocol.
For the most part, we have just about everything CHARM wanted us to do. We were required to do that even in CHARM 1, but we were allowed to put in some additional features. So I don't think there's any, and maybe I can be corrected by anyone on this call who, like Caitlin or Kylie or Jean, I think we pretty much have everything the other echo cohorts have, but we have more. Is that right, Jean? Is that fair to say?
It's a nuanced answer because it depends on what time of life you're talking about. So like
Mhm.
going forward, right now, the only new data we're collecting is all echo wide. And so some of our kids, remember our last March baby was just born in August.
Right.
But you know, some of them are 5 or 6 almost now. So it does depend on life stage and age cohort.
Right. What I
Also,
was specifically wondering about is what for the where we have more than the protocol. Can we tell the difference easily between what's more and what is uniform to everybody? But it
I-
sounds like this might be a more complicated answer we could take offline.
It isn't. I think that the amount of extra stuff that was not theirs is not enormous, but there is some of it in the pregnancy questionnaires, I think, especially. But as we moved out, as you know, we started with the pregnancy, so those were the earliest instruments we developed, and then as the kids get older, the age, then there's they're growing in parallel with the echo program, which is starting to give us much more exact protocols, even in phase 1. So I think the pregnancy contains more variability than later on, more extra stuff.
And Kate has her hand up. Kate, do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, in our data dictionaries, there is a section called questionnaire name, and specifically for the prenatal surveys, the ones that are labeled March and then the rest of the form name, those are the questions that were only asked in CHARM and not entirely in ECHO. So that's a great way to kind of differentiate between the two. Additionally, there are some variables, especially in the prenatal stages, where the end of the variable has an underscore and then the word echo on it. And those differentiate variables that ECHO later on said you need to have these questions being asked in the surveys. So those are 2 different ways you can differentiate. I will say it's a bit more difficult to differentiate when you get into those later years of life, but prenatal is pretty straightforward.
I think that's where most of the division is, in the prenatal, not division, I should say additional features that we programmed in that were not echo wide. I'm not sure the neurodevelopment has much in it that's not echo wide. And my mind isn't drawn to anything, but we'd have to look at the forms themselves. Oh, it's a 1:59, almost done. The hour is upon us. Any other questions? So I would just finish by saying, think of ideas, please. Think of things you would like to do, questions you would like to ask. We can always, by the way, Dan, answer your question. We always plan, for our echo work, anything we begin with our cohort is perfectly available to be studied in all the cohorts. And then we have these usual problems of data harmonization across the cohorts in phase 1. Jean's great work on iodine in Michigan is currently being replicated in at least 5 cohorts in ECHO. So so a lot of the stuff we do, we start with funding locally, can be transported and brought up to a larger population later. No problem with that. And we're encouraged to do that.